before I could build any reasonable copy of Rice Yard, I had to have a track plan. Now, I said that I had been through several iterations of an overall Colorado and Southern plan when I stumbled into this one, but even this was the result of a long journey all its own. The original layout of the yard was much easier to understand, and in some ways easier to interpret as a model. It was this version of the yard that I based my previous plan on when I was still living in my last home. Even for just a little bit of the south end, it was fairly workable and would have made a fair to middling fiddle yard with some attractive scenery sprinkled on. Unfortunately, for a more modern interpretation such as mine, which is based in the late 60s to early 70s, the design of the yard had changed significantly, based partly on the removal of the dual-gauge trackage, as this was not really needed after the 1940s, and a need for expansion, which not only added more yard tracks, but also relocated half of the locomotive facilities. I had to spend a lot of time on historicaerials.com, flipping through 3 different dates of aerial photos to find the best picture of what might have been going on in a given area, and then plotting that into a roughly full-size HO track plan in Xtract-CAD. Eventually, this would help me understand what the different sections of the yard looked like, and in the absence of needed information, I could at least theorize, based on modern rail yard logic, what each of those sections was used for. Now, the designation and operation of these tracks going forward are based on these assumptions. Do not take them internally. With that in mind, if anyone out there actually knows what these tracks were called and what they were used for back in the 60s and 70s, I would welcome any corrections. Until then, we will start at the south end, where 2 tracks split and combine into 3. The 2 mains actually narrow into 1 for the trip into Union Station, but the 2 left-hand switches are the access points for all of the freight activity at Rice Yard. The first switch is the arrival and departure lead, as well as access to the locomotive facility, station tracks, and a small yard along the east bank of the Platte River. I say station tracks because they run right in front of the yard office, but in this scheme, they serve as caboose tracks for northbound trains and a temporary spot for south end switchers. This location is one of 2 where crews will report to work depending on which train they are taking and what position they will be working. The east side yard is being used for short southbound locals and cars designated for the Associated Railroads via the East Side Line, which starts at the end of that double slip switch, and sometimes as a get-out-of-my-way spot for cars that service the locomotive area with carloads of sand and fuel. The roundhouse lead and locomotive-ready tracks run parallel to a small 3-track arrival and departure yard, with easy access for the hostlers between these areas. If at least 1 track in the arrival-departure yard is kept open, it can serve as a default main line for southbound freights if double-track operation is warranted by whatever FREMO setup it's placed in. Passenger trains are still expected to use the Union Station lead in either direction, but that's getting ahead of myself. The second switch coming off the main leads into the classification yard and a couple more staging tracks for southbound locals. Mostly, these trains will be shorter cuts of cars headed for the Connors Spur via South Denver, or the Old South Park or Country Spur via South Park Junction. The classification tracks are thus reserved for longer road freights destined for Pueblo, Cheyenne, the Coors Brewery, transfers to the CB&Q and Rio Grande, and northbound locals. As I have compressed this yard quite a bit from the prototype, other locations like Longmont and Fort Collins or Colorado Springs use the Cheyenne or Pueblo tracks as they are available. My condolences to the yardmaster. The other end of this yard is still being tweaked a bit for operational and physical accuracy, but there are similar areas for cabooses, switchers, and ease of access for locomotives to head to and from service. The east end also has access to the shop and repair and place tracks, so this plan really does cover most, if not all, of the basics of model railroad yard design, and squeezes it into the semi-recognizable shape of what I think is a Denver rail vanning classic. Another nice bit about this end of the yard is that I'm just about obligated to include that fantastic 4-track bridge over Cherry Creek, which, by the way, is still in service and is indeed the only gateway for southbound rail traffic out of Denver in the present day. As far as scenic elements go, I really could not have asked for better than to have the Larimer Street Viaduct crossing the south end, thus making a sensible portal between staging tracks and the model, and Spear Boulevard doing much the same on the east end. A nice bit of the Platte River cuts across the outer corner of the yard near the south office, and its presence actually sets up a nice tree-lined access road between the east side yard and the riverbank. Of course, there's the Cherry Creek area, which has been channeled off by this time, but otherwise keeps a natural appearance with the creek carving its own path and a few wild bushes growing round and about. The toughest part of this entire project will be the structures. Most, if not all of them, will have to be scratch built, but this is made easier considering that I have some section drawings of the shops and roundhouse, so I can get the overall profiles correct and then compress their width to fit their respective areas. The offices will be tougher unless I manage to find some decent photos of them, since most of what I have places them far in the distance of the main subject, or the angle isn't very good. The locomotive area will take a little guesswork as far as the smaller items and debris such as pallets of parts, tanks, and equipment. But the good news is that I have enough pictures of the turntable, operator's cab, and pit to make an accurate model of that, as well as some good shots of the yardmaster's tower and the tiny building at its base. I even know what colors to use. The last thing to note about this track plan is that there is one area that allows the length of the yard to be expanded if need be, and would add another major shop building and parking lot where the old transfer table used to be. There are also a couple of spots where single-track modules could be added during a train show that would connect to Union Station and the East Side line to Myrtle Place. So, as large as it is, I think I have a pretty serviceable track plan that, for all of its compromises, gives a good impression of Rice Yard at its modern zenith. And it's fairly easy to subdivide and understand, which will become very important when it's time to operate it. Alrighty. So, I did an awful lot of walking today to get some of those pictures, but a lot of stuff is made up of things I just found online, and I kind of had to roll with whatever I can get. Like I said, I'm trying to piece this all together to whatever degree of accuracy I can. Otherwise, I'm pretty happy with the design of the yard. You know, there's some compromises that have to be made, but frankly, it's a necessity. If you saw the full-scale plan of this yard, it would be an utter impossibility, even possibly an end scale. So, anyway, that should cover the track plan. After this, we're going to roll into construction, some of the decisions I had to make, and kind of how it all starts to fit together. But it does fit together, and we'll talk about that, including some experimentation that I did in terms of trying to come up with a new method for benchwork construction. So that'll be interesting. So stay tuned. See you next time. Thanks for coming out.